This is Whisper from History, where forgotten voices rise again. A little boy, only 3 years old, placed upon the greatest throne in the world. This was Puyi, the last emperor of China, a ruler who was never the master of his own fate, but a pawn in the hands of greater powers. The Forbidden City stood silent that winter morning in 1908. Its red walls stretched endlessly, enclosing a universe of rituals, secrets, and ghosts of dynasties long gone. But on this day, its corridors echoed not with the commands of generals or ministers, but with the cries of a child. A boy barely 3 years old, clutching at his nanny's sleeve, terrified, confused, and utterly unaware of what was about to happen to him. His name was Joro Puyi. Within hours, he would be carried to a golden throne and declared the Son of Heaven, the supreme ruler of nearly a quarter of the world's population. A toddler, now an emperor. But what kind of empire rests in the hands of a child too small to dress himself? The Qing dynasty was already crumbling by the time Puyi's name was chosen. Once rulers of vast lands, stretching from Beijing to Tibet, Mongolia to Taiwan, the Qing court was weakened by corruption, foreign invasions, and rebellion. The great dragon throne no longer commanded awe. It was surrounded by vultures. Western powers had forced China open through wars and humiliating treaties. Japan was rising fast, eager to carve out its share of Asia. Inside China, revolution simmered, yet within the walls of the Forbidden City, tradition still ruled. To the Empress Dowager Cixi, the empire could only survive if a new ruler was placed upon the throne, one who could be molded, controlled, and presented as divine. And so her eyes fell on the small boy from a noble Manchu family. He was brought to the palace under heavy guard. Servants bathed him in ritual waters, dressed him in silken robes far too large for his tiny frame, and placed the dragon crown upon his head. The child cried. He called out for his mother, but his cries were drowned by the thunder of drums, the clang of gongs, and the chants of ministers kneeling before him. Long live the emperor! At just 3 years old, Puyi became the last emperor of China. But behind the grandeur, a cruel irony unfolded. For even as this child was declared ruler of all under heaven, the dynasty was already collapsing into dust. The Forbidden City, to Puyi, was both a prison and a kingdom. He grew up surrounded not by other children, but by eunuchs, concubines, and ancient rituals. His toys were jade carvings and silk banners. His playmates were elderly servants who bowed at his every word. He learned quickly that he was treated as a living god. If he cried, hundreds rushed to appease him. If he pointed, treasures were brought. If he spoke, scribes recorded his words as imperial wisdom. But beneath this gilded cage, the boy was desperately lonely. He would later recall, in old age, that he felt like an actor forced to play the part of emperor in a play he could not understand. Outside the walls, China changed. In 1911, revolution erupted. The Qing dynasty fell after more than 2.5 centuries of rule. Across the land, warlords carved out territories. Reformers pushed for modernization, and Republican flags replaced the dragon banners. But within the Forbidden City, Puyi still sat on the throne. A child surrounded by ceremonies, cut off from the chaos beyond the palace gates. Yet, one morning, the gates opened not for a ceremony, but for exile. The Republic of China forced the abdication of the Qing dynasty. At the age of 6, Pwa was told he was no longer emperor. He asked a question no one could answer. If I am no longer emperor, who am I? For a time, Puyi lived like a ghost within his own palace. Though stripped of power, he was allowed to remain inside the Forbidden City with a stipend, treated as a relic of the past. He wandered through endless courtyards, where weeds grew between the stones, and where eunuchs smuggled treasures out to sell in secret. But the boy's sense of divinity never left him. Every morning, he dressed in imperial robes, even though no subjects came to bow. He gave commands, even though they carried no weight. He was trapped between illusion and reality, unable to see where one ended and the other began. Outside, China was modernizing, fracturing, rebuilding itself. Inside, time seemed frozen, until one day, Puyi was forced to leave. In 1924, warlord Feng Yuxiang expelled him from the Forbidden City. The gates closed behind him. The boy who had once been worshipped as the son of heaven now found himself wandering Beijing, a man without a throne, without a country, without an identity. But this was only the beginning of his strange journey. As a teenager, Puyi was taken under the wing of a Scottish tutor, Reginald Johnston. Johnston was unlike anyone he had ever known, direct, pragmatic, unafraid to speak to him as an equal. For the first time, Puyi glimpsed the world beyond ritual. He learned English, he rode bicycles, he watched films in secret. And through Johnston, he began to understand just how fragile his position was. Yet Puyi clung to the belief that he could restore the Qing dynasty. He dreamed of returning to the throne, of reclaiming the grandeur he once knew, and there were powers willing to exploit that dream. In the 1930s, as Japan expanded its empire across Asia, its generals saw in Puyi the perfect puppet. They promised him restoration, dignity, a throne once more. Desperate for purpose, Puyi agreed. He was transported to Manchuria, where Japan had carved out a new colony, Manchukuo. There, he was crowned once more, not as Emperor of China, but as Emperor of Manchukuo. Yet it was all a cruel charade. The ceremonies were lavish, the robes shone bright, the soldiers bowed. But behind the scenes, every command, every law, every decision was dictated by Japanese officers. Puyi signed decrees he did not write. He spoke words written by others. He watched as his so-called kingdom became a tool of Japanese conquest. Still, Puyi played the role. He convinced himself that he was emperor once more. But the reality was darker than he admitted. His own people saw him as a traitor, a collaborator with the invaders. To them, the boy who had once symbolized heaven's mandate now symbolized betrayal. And deep down, Puyi knew it too. As World War II engulfed Asia, Puyi's puppet empire crumbled. Japanese defeat loomed. Soviet armies marched into Manchuria in 1945. Puyi, frantic, attempted to flee by plane. But on the tarmac, Soviet soldiers seized him. The emperor, who once ruled all under heaven, now sat in a train car bound for Siberia, a prisoner of war. Years passed in Soviet captivity. The man who had been emperor twice, once as a child, once as a puppet, now scrubbed floors, peeled potatoes, and listened to guards mock his past. His imperial pride broke slowly, day by day, until only regret remained. In 1950, he was handed over to the new rulers of China, the communists. For 10 years, he lived in a re-education camp. He studied Marxism. He wrote confessions of his crimes. He renounced his throne, his divine mandate, his illusions. When he was finally released in 1959, he emerged into a China utterly transformed. Skyscrapers rose where dragon banners once flew. The emperor was gone. Only an ordinary citizen remained. In his final years, Puyi worked as a gardener in Beijing. He trimmed plants, watered flowers, and queued for food like everyone else. Children in the streets no longer recognized him. Tourists passed through the Forbidden City, now a museum, without knowing that the frail man walking nearby had once ruled it. He would sometimes stand before its gates, staring at the vast red walls where his life had begun. He remembered the drums, the robes, the cries of ministers hailing him as the Son of Heaven. And then he remembered the silence that followed the silence of exile, betrayal, and loss. In 1967, Puyi died in relative obscurity. He was 61 years old. His ashes were placed not in the grand imperial tombs of his ancestors, but in a simple cemetery for common citizens. So what remains of the boy emperor, who once held the fate of China in his tiny hands? Puyi's life is a paradox. Crowned at 3, dethroned at 6, a puppet at 20, a prisoner at 40, a gardener at 50. His story mirrors the collapse of imperial China and the birth of a modern nation. He was a symbol of divine rule and its ultimate failure, a ruler without power, a king without a kingdom. But perhaps the most haunting image is that of a child lifted onto a golden throne, crying for his mother while ministers bowed before him. A reminder that history can turn even the smallest, most innocent of children into the center of empires, the pawn of nations, the last witness to a world that has vanished forever. The story of Puyi reminds us that power and glory never lasts forever. Today, the Forbidden City stands as a museum, and those who walk past its gates may rarely think that once a little boy was crowned emperor here, a figure whose role will forever remain alive in history. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.